All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a very special guest. I have Dr. Dalia Nassar, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Sydney. Her work sits at the intersection of the history of German philosophy and environmental philosophy and ethics. Dr. Nassar is the author of The Romantic Absolute, Being and Knowing in Early German Romantic Philosophy, from 1795 to 1804, from Chicago University Press, published in 2013. Her most recent monograph, Romantic Empiricism, Nature, Art, and Ecology, from Herder to Humboldt, Oxford University Press, 2022, investigates the understudied tradition of Romantic empiricism, highlights its significance for the development of ecology, and argues for contemporary relevance in addressing environmental questions and concerns. By showing how Romantic empiricists deepened their understanding of nature through artistic skills and tools, Dr. Nassar also demonstrates the significance of art for knowledge and highlights the ways in which epistemology, aesthetics, and ethics are fundamentally interdependent. Dr. Nassar has a strong interest in the contributions of women philosophers and in the ways in which the philosophical canon formation has sidelined them. She has co-edited with Kristin Jesdal 2 volumes on women philosophers, including an anthology of primary works titled Women Philosophers in the 19th Century, the German Tradition, and the Oxford Handbook of the 19th Century Women Philosophers in the German Tradition, which is also co-edited with Kristin Jesdal and was published in 2024. Dr. Nassar is a co-investigator in the Shirk Canada Grant, Extending New Narratives in the History of Philosophy, and more recently, congratulations, a future fellowship from the Australian Research Council to work on understudied, neglected women philosophers of the late Enlightenment and early Romanticism. So again, Dr. Nassar, thank you so much for being here on The Young Idealist.
Thank you for having me.
I have been a admirer of your academic work for a long time, so it's a real honor to have you on this series. And many of the viewers have also asked multiple times to have you on this series, so it's great to have you here. Now, when thinking about your academic work more broadly, there seems to be a series of thinkers that have interested you. As an admirer of your academic work, I see these thinkers forming a kind of constellation revolving around nature and art and knowledge. So what is it about, let's say, Schelling, Goethe, Herder, Humboldt, Gunderroda, and Stahl, that's a lot of names, I'm sorry, that interests you, and what makes each of their philosophies important for us today?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So let me just say that I think some of your listeners would have certainly heard the name Schelling because you're a big Schelling fan, and anybody who listens to this podcast would have, or not podcast, but this series would have certainly heard Schelling. But a lot of the other names are lesser known names, especially not recognized as philosophers or philosophers in the Anglophone world. And here I'm thinking about Goethe and Herder, about Humboldt and Stahl, Germain de Stahl, and Carolina von Gunderode. So a big part of my work, and this is the constellation work that you're talking about, is not only to sort of work with the big names that everybody knows about, Hegel and Kant, but also to really understand what happened in that moment in the history of philosophy. And that often means looking at those figures that have been forgotten or neglected, sometimes intentionally, sometimes less intentionally, and helping to enrich our understanding of the historical period and of the questions that emerged, why they emerged, by looking at these forgotten figures. So I think I would say in the first instance, but this is not in a kind of a more important, it's just a kind of an explanation of my tendencies, my interests. I really want to understand why certain questions became relevant in the first place. And you can't get from Kant to Hegel, let's put it that way, simply by looking at Kant and Hegel. Why does the absolute become a crucial concept for Hegel, and why is it almost absent something that Kant is very, very cautious and worried about. That moment in the history of philosophy cannot be really understood, and the transition from Kant to Hegel, if we want to just stay with the big names, cannot be really understood if we don't look at what was going on in the 1790s and 1800s. So a big part of my research aims to understand why certain questions became important questions, why certain concepts became central when just 10 or 20 years earlier they were not part of the philosophical conversation. And that involves uncovering lost figures or forgotten traditions. That means going beyond the mainstream of what we think of as philosophical or philosophically relevant to look at thinkers who were part of the conversation, who were recognized by the people that we think of as philosophers like Kant or Hegel as extremely relevant for their own thinking, and whose ideas were incorporated into philosophical positions at that time, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. So my work is interested in those figures that have been sidelined or forgotten in the history of philosophy. And that, in a way, is one that you could say is one way in which these figures form a constellation. They're not part of the canon, with maybe the exception of Schelling, thanks to people like you. But another way, which is more systematic, is the fact that they're all focusing on this triad that you pointed out: nature, art or aesthetic experience, and ethics. All of them are in some way seeing that these questions cannot be addressed independently of one another. And I would say, from my perspective, the most important insights that they deliver to us today is that grasping nature or epistemology or metaphysics, depending on how you're where the emphasis is, whether it's on nature or on grasping, cannot be done independently of moral and ethical questions, and should not be done. Right? We have to always think about the moral implications and the moral consequences of certain metaphysical and epistemological positions. Similarly, and this is the kind of key thesis of the book Romantic Empiricism, that certain insights into the natural world can only be gained if we take seriously the idea that art and aesthetic experience can enhance our cognitive capacities, have a role to play in enlarging, expanding, developing, educating our cognitive capacities so that we begin to see things that we might not have otherwise seen, to grasp and discern relations that we may not otherwise see. And so art, from their perspective, has cognitive value. So that's something, that's the more systematic thing that I see unifying these various thinkers.
Well, thank you very much for that really rich answer. And I'm very so interested in how you're kind of disclosing all of this for us. So, in your most recent book, Romantic Empiricism, you demonstrate how philosophical figures like Kant, well, I think Kant's Critique of Judgment, Goethe, Herder, and Humboldt had such a rich and sophisticated empirical grasp on the natural world, and you illustrate how their grasp of the natural world can both creatively and cognitively aid the knowing subject's approach to natural phenomenon through their aesthetic experience. So what do you think is the importance behind the relationship between art and knowledge? And let me throw in ethics there too, because I know that's important for you as well.
So I'll just give you some examples. I think that would help. Another thesis of the book is that these thinkers that have been sidelined by the history of philosophy played a crucial role in the emergence of ecological modes of thinking, of the science of what became eventually the science of ecology. And they did this because they were able to see not simply isolated parts, but to see the parts in relationship to one another, see how they're all contributing and enabling one another, that they're all conditions of one another, and then they're parts of a whole, of an oikos. The way that they came to these insights have to do with the work that they did as non-scientists. So Herder, for instance, was writing literary criticism. Goethe, we know, was a poet, and Humboldt, although he's the one who's most known as a scientist, an explorer scientist, he also engaged and seriously engaged with the arts. And for each of them, different kinds of arts. So for Humboldt, it's mainly landscape painting. For Goethe, it's poetry. For Herder, it's literary criticism. For each of them, working, as an appreciator of artworks or making artworks enabled them to develop capacities to see the whole that they would not otherwise see. So let me take a few steps back and explain the problem first, and then get you to the solution. So well before Kant, in the Critique of Judgment, talked about the difference between a discursive and intuitive understanding, and said that we only have a discursive understanding, which means that we only can grasp the parts, and out of the parts, we can then come up with a kind of aggregate or composite whole, but we can never, as an intuitive understanding would, begin with the whole and see the parts as parts of a whole, as emerging within this whole, right? So he said that in 1790. Well before Kant said that, Buffon, who was the author of L'Histoire Naturelle, multi-volume work, the head of the Jardin du Roi in Paris, he wrote in one of his many volumes that one of the greatest challenges facing the student of nature is the fact that the knower, the student, proceeds step by step from one thing to the next to the next. But, he says, nature does not proceed linearly. It proceeds in all directions at once. And so there's a problem, a dissonance between how we go about knowing and how reality is what Buffon was saying. And Kant kind of reiterates this by saying, well, we can never really know organisms because they're the kinds of wholes that only an intuitive understanding can know. We can only know mechanistic or mechanical wholes, right? So I think there's a parallel there in the fact that they both take note of a dissonance between how we usually go about knowing and what reality actually is and how it proceeds. Now, the Romantic empiricists, as I've called them, were completely aware of this dissonance, and they thought that it's unlike Kant. They disagreed with Kant in the sense they thought we can meet the challenge. And we can only meet this challenge if we develop our cognitive capacities in new ways. So yes, as Goethe says in one of his essays, Experiment as Mediator Between Subject and Object, yes, it's true, our natural tendency is to proceed in this way, but we don't need to stick with our natural tendency. We need to transform our cognitive capacities, educate them, as he often said. And the way to educate them, they all thought, was through art and aesthetic experience. Now, why art? Well, if you think about what they were after trying to understand, for instance, in Goethe, the relationships between the stages of development in a plant and to see how each of these stages is an expression of the plant whole. Not to see them as isolated parts, but to see the leaves as a manifestation of the same tendency as the corolla, as the calyx, the flower, and so on. Right? So to see that there is a continuity in there, and to see that at each stage there's similarity but also difference, right? And now, of course, plant development takes place over time. So you need to somehow be able to behold every stage while also at the same time, so through your sense capacities, you see this is a leaf, this is a stamen, this is, and so on, this is a petal. And then, but at the same time, you need to bring them all together in your imagination and see them, visualize them in your mind's eye as participating in one kind of development, one stream. Well, that's pretty hard to do, especially if you are someone who thinks, well, we don't have the capacity to move beyond the particular, or the isolated. We cannot, these connections are not something that we're able to discern. They're just imposed upon us. They're not real comments. And well, Goethe says it's actually exactly the kind of capacity we use in order to grasp a poem. Because each line of a poem, each part of a poem is an anticipation of what is to come and a reflection on what has already preceded. And in order to grasp the whole, you need to grasp every one of the parts, but you can only grasp all the parts if you have an understanding of the whole. Or you can think about it in terms of music. How do you understand a piece of music? Not just by listening to tones in isolation of one another, but you have to hear them as part of a musical whole. Otherwise, you're not listening, you're just kind of hearing in an unconscious way. So there is already a capacity in us, and it needs to be schooled through insidious encounter with poetry and music that will allow us to discern a theme in variation, right? Exactly what we discern when we hear music. We discern a theme and variation, and that's exactly what Goethe was going on about. He saw, as he put it, the same organ, as he puts it in the Metamorphosis of Plants, that is never anywhere physically. It's like because it's always reiteration and new iteration, right? The theme itself is always only in the variations, but there is still a theme and you can grasp it. And that's something you can only grasp with the mind's eye, not with the physical eye, but you can still grasp it. And so an artistic or aesthetic education enables us to develop precisely that capacity that we need to discern continuity, to understand development, to see how the different parts are expressions of a whole and are not just mechanically put together as the parts of a clock would be.
So I know you do a lot of work on art, and the philosophy of art, and of course the philosophy of nature, as well as theories of beauty. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of a philosophy of aesthetics and the philosophy of art, do you think there is still a place for beauty in the philosophy of art? And if so, what theories of beauty are still important for us today?
So this is the new work that I'm going to be working on into the next few years. I'm hoping to write a defense of beauty. And I'm going to argue, this is preliminary, but I'm going to argue that despite vast differences between thinkers like Plato in the Symposium or the ideas presented by Diotima in the Symposium and Kant in the Third Critique, that there is actually a significant agreement between them. And all of them agree on two things. That beauty is an essential human experience, and I would say it's something that we absolutely need. Maybe not quite as much as we need water and food, but it has a place in the hierarchy of needs, so to speak. And second, that the experience of beauty does have it is an experience. It requires us to have an encounter with that which is beautiful, right? So Diotima says that when she describes the ladder, you first have to have an encounter with a particular person. Without that encounter, you're never going to have beauty. So it requires a personal, you want to be invested. You're interested and invested, and it brings you, as in your individuality, to appreciate, to become interested in this other person. Of course, we could discuss how this differs from Kant, but nonetheless, the similarity is in the focus on the experiential, in the encounter. Kant says you can't prejudge something as beautiful. You always have to encounter that which someone else calls beautiful and judge it for yourself as beautiful. And so I think this experiential element of beauty, whatever we want to talk about, the specifics, criteria of beauty, we could leave that aside. But it's this experiential element that I regard as absolutely crucial, especially in a time when we're becoming less and less interested in encounters, in experience, in our own individual interest and becoming involved in the world. And I think beauty demands, the experience of beauty is only possible through these kinds of encounters. And for this reason, I think we need to take it seriously, to reevaluate the role of these experiences of beauty and to recognize that they will enable us again to become acquainted with our world because we have become so distant and, in a way, unfortunately, far less interested in these encounters with particular objects and particular landscapes or particular people, particular paintings. We're very happy to just have everything mediated via media. And so I think for that reason, I want to say beauty has a distinctive demand that we need to have an encounter and an experience, and that this is especially timely today. I think that's the role that beauty plays. And I think that we can see it across a whole slew of thinkers that they all would say that's what beauty is about. It's about the experience, it's about the encounter. It's about becoming personally involved and interested. And I would say that's what we all need more of today.
Many of the thinkers that we've discussed this episode, including Schelling, I'm going to add Gunderode, Goethe, have a concrete, systematic philosophy of nature. Do you think returning to the thought of these thinkers can help open up a space for thinking about environmental ethics and ecology?
Yes, I think so for sure. I think one of the great feats of systematic German Naturphilosophie, as instantiated by Schelling and Gunderode, is that they really tried to think from the ground up the relationship between mind and nature and freedom and natural necessity. This is a major metaphysical project. How can you reconcile what appear to be two very different, on the one hand, ways of being? Mind seems to be insubstantial, nature seems to be substance, substance dualism kind of thing. And on the other hand, how can you really overcome the antinomy that Kant recognized, that Kant sort of elaborated between freedom and natural necessity? And really, if you're going to be serious about environmental ethics, nature, and human activity within it, you have to take both into account. You have to think from the ground up in a metaphysically rigorous way what the role or the place of mind is in nature. Nature mind-like or minded? Is there kind of emergence? Is there already mental properties in the activities of organisms, and so on? All of these things need to be considered because it's only on that basis that we can, on the one hand, understand what distinguishes human beings, what it is that enables us to destroy the natural world, and also to be responsible in ways that other beings are not responsible, right? So we have to think from the ground up these fundamental metaphysical questions, but it also helps us to understand the sources of human responsibility. Is it, so that what is distinctive about us and so on. Really, develop a genuine ethics. I think that ethics without metaphysics is not going to be quite satisfactory, and metaphysics that doesn't have an ethical component can be, let's say, fine, abstract, but ultimately inconsequential. And there should always be, every time that we think, we should always think, who are we thinking for? And so I think something that is completely thought out of context is ultimately a false, because we're always thinking for the sake of something or someone. So we need to make sure that when we make propositions, metaphysical propositions, we don't oversee or overlook the fact that there is always implied a kind of a whom are we thinking for, and why does this matter for them?
Oh no, I think that was a wonderful answer. What other thinkers can we use when thinking about ecology or and environmental ethics, other than the ones that we've named? If maybe there are more marginal figures that we can think about.
Well, I do think that, so we've named Schelling and Gunderode as being relevant here. I think there are differences between them that are super interesting to investigate, but I won't go into the differences now. I think Goethe is super interesting for environmental ethics because of the fact that, just as I was saying, we have to transform our cognitive capacities, according to Goethe. Yes, Kant is right. We are discursive by tendency, but that doesn't mean that we should be content with that. We should actually transform our capacities so that we can know better. And this is, accordingly, there's a responsibility to know better. And so at the heart of his epistemology is an ethical impulse or an imperative to improve oneself, to educate oneself. And so this is a really interesting and I think fruitful path to go down, to think, what is the responsibility of the knower? Knowing does not happen in an abstract way, but also knowing requires us to develop in certain ways. And if we don't do that, are we knowing badly? And to whom are we responsible or being irresponsible when we know badly? So I think that's a really important path that we can go into within environmental ethics. I think that Germaine de Stael is another very interesting thinker in this regard. Now, she's not usually thought of as a philosopher of nature. So I bring her into this coterie. You might be questioning that, rightly so to some extent, because most of her work was focused on political and social and moral philosophy. Nonetheless, in the four-volume work on Germany de l'Allemagne, which was set to be published in 1810, but because Napoleon sent his troops to destroy all 10,000 copies of the
Wow.
book, um, yeah, so it was destroyed in Paris, and it was only published 3 years later in 1813 in London, still in French, and it was translated nonetheless very quickly into English. So in that four-volume work on Germany, she presents us with what we might call one of the first histories of German philosophy, and she situates German philosophy within German culture more largely, literature, religion, art, even the natural landscape. She begins by describing the natural landscape in Germany and describes the southern Germany as being very serious. And it's of course, the land of Denker and Dichter, as it has come to be known. So, in any case, so in that book, in the volume on philosophy, she has a chapter called On the Influence of Human Philosophy on the Natural Sciences. And there she looks specifically at Naturphilosophie, Schelling, and Schelling's followers, if we want to call them, who were doing speculative philosophies of nature, trying to ask the kinds of questions we were just discussing, like what is the relationship between mind and nature? Where is freedom? Is it emergent, or is it always there? And is there something distinctive about human freedom? All of those questions being posed. And she wants to defend German Naturphilosophie in contrast to French philosophy of nature, what she regards as mechanistic and materialist philosophies of nature, and also British empiricist philosophies of nature. And her defense is not only limited to, but in part based upon what she sees as the problematic political and moral consequences of materialist and mechanical philosophies of nature. They see the individual as isolated, and therefore they hinder any kind of genuine care for others. And the seeing of oneself as part of a larger community, she says, enables us to become enthusiastic about and interested in the livelihood and well-being of other beings, but a kind of a mechanistic picture that sees all of us as these isolated atoms that can grow and flourish on our own, and perhaps better with nobody else, is going to hinder that kind of social camaraderie and flourishing. There's a lot more to be said there, but I think that's a very, very interesting take as well on the role of metaphysics, the relationship between certain metaphysical positions and certain social political positions.
Well, again, thank you for discussing some of these thinkers. This series also has a series dedicated to the women of European philosophy. I already have several episodes on that. A lot of your central work as well is bringing back focus to these figures that are super important. The women of the 19th century in Germany, but also women thinkers in both thought and culture. And so my last question to you would be, are there any names or any thinkers and books that you think that these thinkers that maybe viewers can watch and jump into a text that you recommend?
So I would recommend having a look at the volume that Kristen Yestel and I co-edited, Women Philosophers in the Long 19th Century, from Oxford in 2021. That is meant to be a first dip. It's more than a dip, really, but a first encounter, to go back to the idea of encounter, with the works of 9 women from the long 19th century. And by that, we kind of go from the French Revolution to World War I. And we chose only 9, although we could have added many, many more. But our choice for sticking with a smaller number of women was because we wanted to give quite significant word count for each of them. Rather than having a snippet, we wanted to have either a whole chapter or 3 or 4 chapters from a book, or even a whole book in some cases, if we could fit it in there, or a whole essay. So by Rosa Luxemburg, we have a whole wonderful essay that would give you a great understanding of socialist philosophies of economy in a way that is clear, is concise, and compelling. We have a number of works by Carolina von Gunderode, one of which is The Idea of the Earth, a very, very interesting take on the human relationship to the natural world and the place of things like virtue in relation to the earth, as she puts it. We also have works by early phenomenologists in there. You're a fan of Edith Stein, sorry. You're a fan of Edith Stein. So we have some sections from her book on empathy. And we also have selections from Walter. So those are the 2 phenomenologists. And Gerda Walter, Stein has received a bit more attention than Walter, but Walter is an incredibly interesting thinker. She was writing about social ontology before it became a thing. And, if you look at her biography, she was a Marxist and then became a phenomenologist and then converted to Christianity. And she wrote a book with that title, From Marxism to Christianity, or something like that. And what I think is fascinating about someone like Walter, but also I would add Bettina von Arnim there, because Bettina von Arnim is most well known as a romantic or a late romantic, but she also wrote several books which are incredibly empirically oriented about the state of the poor in Germany. And these books were recognized by people like Marx and Engels as being incredibly important and illuminating, as opening up new spaces for dialogue. So in the same way that I would say Walter offers to, studying someone like Walter, you see, oh, she was a Marxist and a phenomenologist. Those 2 traditions are not totally opposed to one another. In her work, we see how they can come together, and we have a whole book on social ontology. Interesting. And similarly with Bettina von Arnim, we see how romanticism and socialism have many things in common, and how certain tendencies in the one make space for certain ideas that become socialist ideas. So what studying these women, I think, reveals is that the usual ways in which we separate movements in the history of philosophy are far too crude and undermine the richness of these movements and all of the potentials that they all have, and the ways in which they reciprocally enriched one another.
Well, I really can't thank you enough for navigating us through several phases of both your work and several important areas of, art, knowledge, and ethics, and also speaking lastly there about the important women thinkers in culture and thought. So thank you so much for being a participant in this series. It's a real honor, actually. And is there anything that you're currently working on right now, a paper or a draft for an article that you'd like to share?
Got a paper that I'm excited about on Stahl and her political philosophy, its connection to her metaphysics. So that's sort of what I was hinting at there, that I've got this particular take that. But I'm also working on how Schelling was really important for Alexander von Humboldt. And I've got some other stuff on, I'm gonna really start working on beauty more and more. And I'm fascinated by the figure of Diotima and the way that Diotima reappears in the history of philosophy. And her reappearance is both an inspiration for many women who see her as the first woman philosopher, or maybe not the first, but as an exemplary woman philosopher. And so she encourages them to be women philosophers, but also because of the the fact that she sees beauty, truth, and goodness as connected, and often very many women philosophers also see the three as connected in the same way that the romantic empiricists did. So I'm interested in seeing how this figure of Diotima comes back, reappears over the years, and what kind of influence Diotima has over, especially in the 19th century.
Well,
Yeah.
again, thank you so much. And again, I can't thank you enough for being so kind and being so thoughtful and just illuminating all of these ideas. It really was an encounter. It was a good encounter.
That's very nice. I'm very happy to meet you as well. It was my pleasure.